Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chav Beis, Daf 22 of Masechta Moed Katan. Friends, Daf Chav Beis is a very interesting daf. First we talk about at what point does Shiva begin? Very interesting question. There must be tons of literature on this, but of course we're just going to do the simple layer of it. And then we get into all sorts of different distinctions between mourning for a parent versus mourning for other relatives. So lots of interesting stuff and practical stuff on this daf. So friends, let's jump in. We're all the way at the bottom of Daf Chav Aleph Moed Beis. Ibayu de Asakasha. We're now on Daf Chav Beis Moed Aleph. Halach Gadol Abayis Leves Akvaris Mahu. What happens if the most senior person in the house went to the burial? So meaning, imagine that the burial was not right next to where the people live. Like you actually had to travel to where the burial was, right? So at what point does the person who went to escort the body to be buried at this other place, when does he count Shiva? So Tashma Kamidir the Amr B'chia Ba'aba Amr B'yochanan Afilu Halach Gadol Habayis Leves Akvaris. Even if the most senior person in the house went to the cemetery, Mona Imoyen, he counts with them. Let's go weiter. Mona Imoyen. What do you mean by he counts with them? B'atanya Mona La'atzmo. But it says that he counts for himself, his own 7. Lokasha, it's no problem. Hada also B'go Tlasa. It depends if he came back within 3 days. Or if he didn't come back within 3 days. Like Rav says to the people of Hatsalfoni, that if you come back within 3 days, so then those people who went to the burial will count Shiva with you, will sit Shiva with you 7 days. But if they don't come back within 3 days, so then they'll count their own 7 days. Let's just go on for another second. Amrlu Rava of Mechoza. Rava said to the people of Mechoza, Atun you to lo azlisu basa arsa, that you don't go after the coffin. Mechima adrisu apaychu mibava da avula aschilu manu. From when you turn away from like the gates of the city, already start counting Shiva. Friends, what does all of this mean? It's super interesting. I mean, there must be a lot of halacha l'maisa stuff over here, but I don't know. Imagine somebody passes away in Chutz La'aretz, and then they fly the body to Eretz Yisrael to be buried. So let's say some people in the family went, some people in the family didn't go, right? So when did the people start sitting Shiva? So my understanding is that basically, okay. So let's say somebody passes away in New York, and they bury the person in New York. So right, mishanista magola, right? Once the coffin is closed and like they cover it up with dirt, and the person is buried, so then the people start sitting Shiva. But what about in a case where he's being flown to Eretz Yisrael? So imagine that, I'm not talking halach over here, but it would make sense to me that if the entire family went with the body to Eretz Yisrael, so again, after the burial, they would sit Shiva. That's when the Shiva begins, not until then. However, what if not everybody is going with the body? Right? Or like in this case, right, where they don't have airplanes and they don't have WhatsApp and all sorts of communication, right? So we see that Rava was telling the people of Mechoza that if you're sending the body to Eretz Yisrael to be buried from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, so the people who are staying in Bavel, once already the body leaves them, so at that point, even though the body hasn't been buried yet, they would already start sitting Shiva, right? So I don't know what the implications are, in terms of like, I don't know, let's say part of the family flies to Eretz Yisrael and part of the family doesn't. So maybe the people who stay in New York, if that's where it is, so maybe they start sitting Shiva immediately once they leave the body. I don't know, right? But the implication here for our Gemara though seems to be that, so that's kind of what our Gemara is talking about, right? So if you have this person from the house who went with the body to be buried, so the people in the house who are not going with the body, so they start sitting Shiva already from when they're no longer with the body. When this person who went to bury the body, if he comes back home, if it's within 3 days and everybody else has already been sitting Shiva, so then he can sort of join them. But if it's after 3 days already, so then he starts counting Shiva, I imagine 7 days from when the body was buried. Super, super interesting stuff, Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon Afiluba Bayom Ashvi Mimakum Karov Monei Moed. So Reb Shimon had said that even if, right, so we had said at the end of the daf yesterday that if like a relative kind of showed up at home and everybody's sitting Shiva, so we said if it's within the first 3 days and he lives in a place that's close enough that he could have gotten there from the beginning, so then he could just count with them. Says Reb Shimon, he's lenient, he samer, that even if this happened, he arrived on the 7th day, he could just, count with them and end with them that day. Omer B'chia Bar Gamda, Omer Reb Yossi ben Shaul, Omer Rebbe, Vushabo Matzu Menachmin Etzlo. That's only if when he came, there were still mourners there. Meaning, if he came, because on the 7th day, once already the mourners leave, so Shiva is over. So if he comes back on the afternoon of the 7th day and like Shiva is over, so then he missed it. But if there are still mourners there, so then basically he gets there and just ends Shiva with them. But Rav Onan wants to know, Ninaru lamud v'lo amdu mau teku. But what if when the relative comes in, people are still there, they're like about to get up, but they didn't quite get up? Does it count? Does he have to sit Shiva? Does he get up with them? We don't know. Gemire Chavre de Reb Abba Barchia mi Reb Abba. So Reb Abba Barchia's friend learned from him. Umanu, who's this friend? Reb Zera. V'amir l'Chavre de Reb Zera mi Reb Zera. To those who say that Reb Zera's friend learned from him. Umanu, who's the friend? Reb Abba Bar Bchia Bar Abba. Okay. Omer Reb Yochanan, it says Reb Yochanan, Halacha Reb Shimon ben Gamliel betrefis, that the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel when it comes to trefas, which we'll have to learn about in a minute. Halacha Reb Shimon be'avil, that the halacha is like Reb Shimon when it comes to mourners. Halacha Reb Shimon, so Reb Shimon be'avil hada amarim. So when we say that the halacha is like Reb Shimon by a mourner, so it's that which we just said, that if the relative comes in and it's day 7 of mourning, he could still just basically have a very brief shiva with them. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel betrefis ditanya, and the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel when it comes to trefas, as we learn in a brayse, b'nei me'ayim shenikvu, that if you have intestines that got pierced, v'leicha so samton, and there's mucus that is closing the hole of the intestines, kshera, div Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, it's kosher. That's Reb Shimon ben Gamliel's opinion. My leicha, what's mucus? Amar of Kana shirka de me'aya de nofik agav tuchka. It's sticky liquid of the intestines that comes out if you force it. Okie dokie. Amar Mandu. Now a certain fellow said, Izke ve'esek ve'agmar l'shmaita mipume demari. A certain fellow said, if only I would have the opportunity to go to Eretz Yisrael and learn this halacha from Reb Abba himself. Kisolek ashkechel Reb Abba b'redu b'chi bar Abba. And sure enough, this fellow had the opportunity to go to Eretz Yisrael, and he had the opportunity to ask Reb Abba, and he says, no. So Amar Mara Locha Reb Shimon ben Trefis, and he says and this fellow said to Reb Abba, he says, so is it true? Did you really say that the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel when it comes to Trefis? Amalei Ona ein halacha amri. And he said, no, I said that the halacha taka is not like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Reb Shimon be'avel mai. And then this fellow asked Reb Abba, and what about, is the halacha like Reb Shimon when it comes to a mourner? Amalei pluktaninu. He says, look, it's a machlokas. Deitmar Rav Chizda amar halacha, B'chein amar B'yochanan halacha, Rav Nachman amar ein halacha. Rav Chizda and Reb Yochanan say that the halacha is like Reb Shimon when it comes to a mourner. Rav Nachman says the halacha is not like Reb Shimon. Now it says the Gemara, Ve'en halacha Reb Shimon ben Gamliel b'trefis, and now the Gemara sort of says that, okay, when it comes to trefis, the halacha is not like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Ve'halacha Reb Shimon be'avil, but the halacha is like Reb Shimon when it comes to a mourner, that if the relative comes on day 7, he basically just wraps up the shiva with the rest of the family, to Amar Shmuel, because after all, Shmuel says, halacha k'divrei HaMekil be'avil, that when it comes to mourning, the halacha is like the lenient opinion. Hakol HaMeisim Kula. Now we're going to learn different distinctions between your parents and the other relatives that you sit shiva for. Hakol HaMeisim Kulan madchem itaso harizim meshubach. So when it comes to the other relatives, so if you bury them quickly, then that is good. Alav v'alimo harizim meguna. But if you rush to bury your parents without giving them proper eulogies, then that is disgraceful. However, if it's Friday, if it's Erev Shabbos or if it's Erev Yom Tov, so then itaka is good, because otherwise you'll have to wait till after Shabbos or after Yom Tov, which is not as good. So better to, if it means you have to hurry for the funeral on an Erev Shabbos and Erev Yom Tov, so then in that case hurrying is good. Because that is being done out of the honor, in order to honor one's father and mother, so that they would not be sort of waiting to be buried. For the other relatives, if you want, you can sort of lighten up on the workload, but also if you want, you do not have to lighten up. But for your father and your mother, you lighten up on the workload. I'll call Amesim Kulon and all of the other relatives. If he wants to expose his shoulder, so he can expose his shoulder. I love it, Balimo Cholitz. But for your father and mother, you expose your shoulder. And there's a story with a certain Gadol Ador, like the greatest rabbi of the generation, Shemiz Aviv, that his father died. Uvikesh Lachlotz, and he wanted to expose his shoulder. Uvikesh Gadol Ador Acher She'imo Lachlotz. However, there was another Gadol Ador who was with him, who also wanted to expose his shoulder. This Gadol Ador, his parent, what does it say? His father passed away. That his father passed away, and the Gadol Ador wanted to expose his shoulder, but I guess out of mutual respect, this other Gadol Ador wanted to expose his shoulder as well. But the mourning Gadol Ador didn't want that the other Gadol Ador should expose his shoulder, so he just v'nimna v'lo chalatz, so he just simply did not expose his shoulder, and by not exposing his shoulder, his fellow Gadol Ador also did not expose his shoulder. Amar Abai says, Abai Gadol Ador Rebbe Gadol Ador She'imo Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha, and says Abaye, he puts some names on them. He says, look, the Gadol Ador who wanted to expose his shoulder was Rebbe. The other Gadol Ador was Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha. Super interesting. You don't hear so much. I mean, Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha comes up. You heard about Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov. You learned about him. Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha, I didn't realize that he was like a co-Gadol Ador with Rebbe. It's pretty big stuff. Okay, so it says Abai that the Gadol Ador was Rebbe and the co-Gadol Ador was Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha, and Rebbe refrained from exposing his shoulders so that Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha wouldn't expose his shoulder. To those who say Gadol Ador Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha, to those who say it was the opposite, that the Gadol Ador was Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha, and he refrained from exposing his shoulder because Gadol Ador She'imo Rebbe, that his co-Gadol Ador was Rebbe, and he didn't want Rebbe to expose his shoulder. Now, Bishlam Leman Amar Gadol Ador She'imo Rebbe. So it makes sense if we say that the mourner was Rav Yaakov bar Acha, and he didn't expose his shoulder because he didn't want Rebbe to expose his shoulder. Hanu dinimna v'lo chalatz. That's why Rav Yaakov bar Acha didn't expose his shoulder. That way Rebbe also would not. Leman Amar Rav Yaakov bar Acha. But according to the opinion that the co-Gadol Ador was Rav Yaakov bar Acha and the mourner was Rebbe, well then that doesn't really make sense. Amai nimla v'lo chalatz. How come Rebbe refrained from exposing his shoulder so that Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha wouldn't? Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, Nasi Ava, B'chuli Amma Mechai v'lachlotz. Who was Rebbe's father? Rebbe's father was Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel was a Nasi, and everybody, not just Rebbe, but including Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha, everybody would have to expose their shoulder. So it wouldn't make sense if we're saying that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel passed away and Rebbe didn't expose his shoulder so that Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha wouldn't expose his shoulder. Everybody has to expose their shoulder. It's the Nasi. Kasha. So it's a question according to the opinion that says that the Gadol Ador was Rebbe and the co-Gadol Ador was of Yaakov bar Acha. Al kol hamesim kulan, and all of the other relatives, mistaper lacher lamed yom, you can get a haircut after 30 days. Alav val imo, but for one's father and one's mother, ad shigaru bo chaverev, until his friends say, hey, you better get a haircut. Let's go weiter. Al kol hamesim kulan, for all of the other relatives, nichnas leveis hasimcha la'achar lamed yom. After 30 days, you can already go to a to a place that's lebedik, to a place that's very happy. Al aviv al imo la'achar yud beis chodesh. But for one's father and one's mother, if one is mourning their father or their mother, so then for 12 months they refrain from going to a festive place. Amar Rabbi Bar Bachana l'simchas mireus. Says Rabbi Bar Bachana, then when we say that after 30 days for a different relative, you would be able to go to a place that's lebedik, that's talking about simchas mireus. You can go to a fabrengen with some friends at the house, maybe drink a little schnapps, I don't know, do whatever people do at these things. I wouldn't know so much. Although I could think back to when maybe I would have known. But why? What's the point? Friends, apparently there's a thing. People get together with other people. It's fun. And so you could do that. And that's what you're allowed to do. But you wouldn't necessarily be allowed to go to a chasana. Meisvei, we have a kasha, l'simchos mireus lamed yom. But one second, we have a brisa that says that after 30 days, he's allowed to, that both for happiness and for sort of fabrengens, it's 30 days. Meaning, yes, after 30 days, you could already hang out with your friends, but in addition to mireus, but also simcha, you can also go to a chasana. So, kasha. So it sounds like a question. Ameimar masni achi. Ameimar says, Rabbi Bar Bachana says, Rabbi Bar Bachana, the simchas mireus mutu likanis la'altar. Says Ameimar that what Rabbi Bar Bachana is saying, that actually, fabrengen, you don't even have to wait 30 days. V'atanya l'simcha shloshim u'l'mireus shloshim. But one second. But it says that for happiness, you have to wait 30 days, and also for fabrengens, you have to wait 30 days. Lo kasha, it's no problem. Depends if it's an initial banquet or a reciprocal banquet. Okay? What does that mean? I don't know. Apparently people would take turns having fabrengens or something like that. So if they were starting the fabrengen cycle, so wait until after 30 days. But if they already started the fabrengen cycle, and now it's your turn to fabreng, so then, even if it's within 30 days, you could fabreng. For all of the other relatives, you tear kriya a tefach, a handbreadth. For one's father and one's mother, you have to reveal your heart. My kra'ah, says Abba, what's the pasuk? Vayichazik David b'vgadav, that David chapped his clothing, vayikroim, and he tore them, v'nechiza pachos mitefach, and chapping is a tefach. Friends, how much is chapping? A tefach. Hakol ha'mesim kulan, afilu lavush asara chalukin, in ukreya elyon. For other relatives, even if you are wearing 10 layers of clothing, you only tear the outer layer. Halav balima, one's father and mother, korea es kulan, you rend all layers of garments. Va pikarsuso, one's turban, ena me'akeves, you don't have to tear that. This applies both to men and to women. Reb Shimon ben Elazar says, Reb Shimon ben Elazar Aisha, that a woman, koras as a tachton, she will first tear the bottom layer, and then turn around her shirt, and then tears the upper layer. So she's not kilu, if she would cut through all the layers directly, then she would sort of be exposing her heart, which we don't want to happen. So if she sort of first starts with the lower layer and then flips it around to the back, then even when tearing the upper layers, the tearing of the first layer is not in the front. Al kol amesim kulan, all of the other relatives, rotza mavdil kame sofa shalo, rotza enu mavdil. Apparently, I think this has to do with basically the kind of clothing that they would wear. I think it was some kind of shirt that has a deep V-neck or of some sort. I feel like it's very traditional looking shirt. So if you kind of tear that V, so it might not necessarily be super noticeable. So you have to kind of tear it in a way that it's not just an extension of the V. All right. I love it about imo. Right, so again, I call them the other ones, Ratza Mavdil Kame Safashlo, Ratza Eno Mavdil. So if you want, you can make a very noticeable kind of tear, or if you want, you can just kind of tear past the V. and it's not as noticeable. But by his father and his mother, you have to make a very noticeable tear. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, Kol kriya she'ena mavdil kamisofa shelo, any tearing that isn't like a significant, noticeable tear, enu ela kereshel tiflus, it's a joke. Omer Babo says, Babo, my time with Rabbi Yehuda, how come Rabbi Yehuda says this? Tichsiv, as the pasuk says, by Elisha, when Eliyahu and Avi was taken away to the Eibishter, vayichazik v'vgado vayikroim l'shnayim kroim, that Elisha chapped his clothing and tear them into 2 tears. Mimash m'shnayim vayikroim in Yudea shehein l'shnayim. If it says that once already, it says that Elisha tore his garment, doesn't that memela mean into 2? How many things he's tearing it into 1? The point is that it has to be noticeable that it's torn into 2. By the other relatives, so after Shiva, you can sort of roughly re-sew the garment, and you could properly re-sew it after 30 days. But for one's father and mother, you can sort of roughly re-sew the tear after 30 days, but you never properly re-sew it. And a woman could immediately roughly re-sew the garment, so out of her honor. When Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, I'll call a mason. When it comes to the other relatives, if you want, you could tear with your hands, which will be a more rough tear and more difficult to fix. Or if you want, you could use like a scissors or something, which would be easier to fix if you want to. But for one's father and mother, you must tear with your hands, which is a rougher tear and more difficult, and you can't really fix well after. From Rabbi Yochanan, call Mesim Kulan, and all the other relatives, mi bifnim, you have to tear kriya on the inside. So there's 2 ways to understand that. Either, meaning you can tear kriya on the inside. Either it means like under your coat or something, in a way that not everybody notices that you're tearing, or maybe inside where not everybody sees you. But But for one's father and one's mother, you have to tear sort of in a noticeable way, whether in public or sort of on the outer, not hidden under your coat. Amr of Chizda says of Chizda, v'chein the nasi, and that applies as well to the nasi. As we learned also earlier, right, when we said about Rebbe and his father, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, that everyone, right, that everyone has to tear kriya, sort of in a public way. Meisvei, but we have a kasha lo hushvu lo avav limo el leichui bilvad, that we're going to see in a few days a list of people that are like your parents, and we say that they're only like your parents in that you do not rend the garment, you do not re-sew the garment. But my love, afilu l'nasi, and that seems to be implying that a nasi as well is only similar to one's father and mother in that you don't re-sew the garment. But in terms of having to tear it on the outside in a noticeable way, maybe it's not the same. No, that's not true. Levar mi nasi. No, nasi would be an exception to that rule, meaning a nasi is even like the parents in that you tear kriya in a noticeable way. Nisiya shachiv, there was a time when the nasi passed away. Amr of Chizda of Chanan bar Rava, and Rav Chizda says to Rav Chanan bar Rava, Kfi asisa, take a mortar and flip it over, v'kumala, and stand on it, v'achri kriya la'alma, and show everybody that you're tearing kriya, i.e., tear kriya in a very public manner because the nasi passed away. Al-chacham cholitz miyamin, when we say that you expose your shoulder, so for a Talmud Chacham, you expose your right shoulder. Al-abezdin mismal, when the leader of the court passes away, so you expose your left shoulder. Al-nasi mikan mikan, when the nasi passes away, so then you expose both shoulders. Friends, that was Daf Chav Beis of Masechta Moed Katan. I think there was a lot of interesting things over there. The Daf on Daf Chav Beis, the Daf began with talking about at what point does Shiva begin. Right, so if you are at the burial, so then Shiva begins when after the person is buried. If you are not attending the burial, so then Shiva begins when you leave the body to go home. We then began discussing different differences between when one is burying their father and mother versus when one is burying other relatives. We said that by other relatives, right, it would be good to sort of bury them quickly, but by one's father and one's mother, you have to properly eulogize them. Although we said that an exception would be on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tiv, because if you don't quickly bury them, then you might have to wait till afterwards. We said that by other relatives, if you want to, you can minimize work if you want. You don't minimize work, but by one's father and one's mother, you certainly minimize work. By other relatives, if you want to, you can expose your shoulder. If you don't want to, you don't expose the shoulder. But by one's father and one's mother, you expose your shoulder. And we said that applies to a nasi as well. With regard to getting haircuts, so for other relatives, so for 30 days, you don't get a haircut. After 30 days, you can get a haircut. But for one's father and mother, you can't get a haircut until somebody points out, like, hey, you should really get a haircut. We also said that when it comes to other relatives, so after 30 days, you could already, go to, parties and things. But for one's father and mother, it would be a year. When it comes to kriya, to rending your garments, so for other relatives, you rend your garments for a tefach, for your father and mother, until you reveal your heart. For other relatives, you just have to do kriya on the outer garment. For your parents, you do a kriya on all of the garments, and you have to use specifically your hands so that it's a rough tear, so that you can't really tear it back, sew it back properly. When it comes to other relatives, after Shiva already, after 3 days, you can already sew it back roughly. After Shiva, you can kind of sew back the tear roughly. After Shloshim, you could sew it back properly. For one's father and mother, after Shloshim, you can sew it back roughly, but you can never sort of tear it. You can never sew it back properly. Women would be able to sew it back, sew the tear roughly, even sort of immediately. Okay, and finally we said that by one's father and by other relatives, you can sort of tear kriya in a more discreet way, but for one's father and mother, you tear it in sort of a more public way. And we said that the same would apply also to a nasi, if the nasi passes away. Friends, that was the Chav Aleph or Chav Beis of Masechta. That was Chav Beis, I think, of Masechta Moed Katan. Hope you enjoyed it. Peace out.